Coney Island section of Brooklyn, and possibly around the city. For those who don't know, the Mitchell Lama is a government-funded housing program that provides for affordable housing in New York City. We must ensure that only those who are eligible have an opportunity to be awarded a Mitchell Lama apartment. This case exposed a pervasive pattern of corruption and bribery in deciding who received an affordable apartment in the Luna Park Housing Corporation. And this case is also about working class families being deprived of the affordable housing that they've been waiting for, being victimized by the very people entrusted with regulating and managing the availability of this very limited housing stock. Now, today we arrested 3 women who we allege controlled the purchasing process at the Luna Park Housing Development in Coney Island, which is one of the largest Mitchell Lama developments in the state, housing 6,000 people in 5 residential built towers. Now, because these publicly funded homes are in very high demand, there's a mechanism in place to ensure that apartments are awarded as required by law. There are 3 legal ways to get a Mitchell Lama apartment. One, there's an internal waiting list for current residents who want to move into a different apartment. List for new prospective purchasers or buyers of these apartments, and 3, succession rights, under which a family member, as defined by law, of a current shareholder can claim succession rights to that apartment if they've lived in that apartment for 2 continuous years. What this investigation revealed is that at Luna Park, there was a 4th option to secure an apartment, and that was bribing those who controlled the application process. The 3 people arrested today are Anna Trebich, a former president of the board of directors, Irina Zeltzer, a former treasurer, and Karina Andrian, a former office manager of the management company overseeing the operations at Luna Park. They will be arraigned later today on charges that include 4th and 5th degree conspiracy, 2nd degree grand larceny, 2nd degree forgery, and 1st degree commercial bribe receiving. These are serious charges and carry a maximum sentence of 5 to 15 years in prison. Our investigation revealed a pattern of corruption in many of the applications where succession rights were being claimed. We allege that the 3 defendants corrupted the normal process and pocketed hundreds of thousands of dollars in bribes by allowing unqualified applicants to secure apartments in Luna Park. We further allege that much of this bribe money was spent on luxury goods. Some of them you see right in front of us here, furs and bags, but other money was spent on properties in Florida and other lavish spending. This conspiracy was rather straightforward. By paying bribes ranging anywhere between $10,000 and $120,000, this conspiracy allowed at least 18 prospective tenants to bypass the lawful application process, jumping over those on waiting lists and purchasing apartments in Luna Park that they were not entitled to. And all they had to do to skip the normal process was allegedly make cash payments to these defendants, who then took care of all the paperwork. In order to fool HPD and to get around their oversight, the defendants allegedly forged documents, including marriage certificates and birth certificates, bank records, and other utility bills that they needed to create the bogus familial relationship, and also to falsely show that they lived with their so-called relative in this apartment for 2 continuous years. We allege that the defendants filled out these forged documents and the application that went along with them and submitted them to New York City HPD for approval. HPD, relying on the management company of Luna Park, routinely approved these fraudulent documents. and then thereby approve the application. So I'm going to show you a couple of examples to illustrate how this scheme worked. If you look at the screen, you're going to see two marriage certificates that are associated for what we have deemed apartment number 3. On the left is the original certificate. Now, we've redacted information to protect the privacy of some of the parties who were involved in this, but what you'll also see that there's missing information from on the right-hand side. And what's important about that missing information, importantly, the name of the bride and groom's parents. That way, there was no need to worry about a discrepancy between the names on the marriage certificate and the names on the birth certificate, which was also required for the application. The reason they needed to show this proof is they needed the marriage certificate to show that the applicant's last name, which was actually different than that of the vacating shareholder, okay, who vacated the apartment, they needed to show that they were related. And they were claiming on this application that they were sister and brother, so they had to show that her maiden name matched his name, and so they forged it. You can see very clearly on that how they've changed the names to match. They also needed to forge bank statements, and they did so by changing the address to falsely show the applicant had lived in the apartment for 2 years. And then accompanying the forged documents is a letter that defendant Andrian then submitted to HPD, saying that they reviewed the paperwork and that the succession claim was appropriate. So in this example, we allege that the buyer paid a bribe of $26,000 for this apartment. I'll show you another example from a different apartment, which is deemed apartment number 11. In this case, we allege a bribe of $93,000 to facilitate the purchase of a 3-bedroom apartment. Claiming that the applicant was the sister of the shareholder who was vacating the apartment, the applicant needed to submit a birth certificate showing that the two women, who are completely unrelated, had the same mother. The document on the left is the original notarized translation, and on the right is the forgery. As you can see, the names and nationality of the mother were altered. They now match the names and nationality on the birth certificate of the purported sister. Again, the last step was to change the utility bill so they could show that they were living together for 2 years. So that's how the scheme worked. Corrupt insiders got cash bribes, applicants got the apartment they wanted without having to wait, and honest families were left out in the cold, never getting off waiting lists. As you can tell from the documents I've shown, this was a complicated investigation to get all this information, to get the original documents. The indictment that we filed today encompasses bribe receiving, forgery, and larceny of 18 apartments, which have a total fair market value in the Coney Island section of Brooklyn of $5 million. We also allege that the bribes paid to these defendants totaled approximately $874,000. We would have to be naive to think that these were the only apartments in Luna Park that were awarded through bribery. In fact, we actually believe that this was the norm, not the exception, and residents have told us that it's an open secret that this scheme had been in place for many years. So our investigation is ongoing. We also believe that Luna Park is not the only Mitchell Lama housing complex where corruption and lax oversight may be allowing unqualified applicants to get awarded apartments. But make no mistake, this scheme has real victims. Untold numbers of hard-working families are deprived the affordable housing that they've been waiting for, and meanwhile, the taxpayers are subsidizing housing for people who do not qualify. Affordable housing programs can only achieve their stated goals when they're administered in fair and honest ways and have meaningful oversight. Brooklyn is a great place to live, and we all know how valuable an affordable apartment can be in this borough. But sadly, we also know that the booming housing market in Brooklyn is fertile ground for fraud and corruption. So I'm committed to doing enforcement actions just like this one to protect critical housing programs which serve families who need them the most. And we will continue to spend our resources here on these types of white-collar crimes in the real estate industry and other areas where public trust is undermined by greed and corruption. Who has worked on this case, especially our partners in DOI and HUD, and the prosecutors and investigators from the Brooklyn District Attorney's Office who worked very hard to put this complicated case together. We're now going to hear from our DOI commissioner, and then we can take some questions.
Thank you, DA Gonzalez. I'm so proud to stand here with you and your team of prosecutors to announce the criminal charges in this case, one that highlights the importance of protecting fair access to our scarce, affordable housing stock, including city-supervised Mitchell Lamas like Luna Park. This indictment demonstrates that those who choose to manipulate the rules for their own gain by devising conspiracies to rig access to affordable housing will be held accountable. We will not allow housing in the city to be used as someone's get-rich-quick scheme. As the DA said, the criminal plan here was simple, the equivalent of passing an envelope of cash under the table to snatch an apartment from those families waiting on the list. But the execution of that plan was complex, requiring deep knowledge and access to the Mitchell Lama rules and operations. As charged in the indictment, these defendants were insiders at Luna Park. They were either at the managing agent or on the board of trustees of the co-op board. They were officers of the board. They compromised the integrity of the application process at Luna Park for their own financial benefit. They used these apartments effectively as their personal piggy bank, creating and providing forged documents to support false claims to these units in return for hundreds of thousands of dollars in bribes, according to the indictment. In just one example from the indictment, one defendant demanded $120,000 in bribe money in exchange for the right to purchase a two-bedroom apartment at Luna Park. This case began in 2017 when DOI received allegations that access to Luna Park's apartments were being illegally sold in exchange for cash bribes. Our investigators began the painstaking work of combing through the reams of documents one by one, slowly assembling the pieces of this conspiracy and exposing the fraud. DOI found two basic schemes according to the charges. One that helped external applicants jump the wait list, and a second that helped individuals fraudulently claim a family tie to the apartment, which, as the DA said, is commonly described as a succession right to those apartments. Over the course of the investigation, DOI compared the applications submitted to the city's Department of Housing and Housing Preservation and Development with other documents maintained by other government agencies. And DOI investigators found that something did not add up. In one case, an external applicant applied to purchase a one-bedroom apartment as if they were related to an individual waiting on the wait list. The rules for Mitchell Lama allow an individual on the wait list to give up their spot for a relative who is listed on the original application. In this case, an employee of the management company provided a bogus application from 1992 that made it look like the new applicant was related to the person on the wait list. The bogus application effectively allowed this external applicant to jump in front of thousands of families patiently waiting on the real list. In another example, in documents submitted to HPD, an original apartment shareholder appeared to have been granted succession rights to the apartment to his supposed niece and nephew, purportedly based on signed and notarized documents. The problem was the owner had been dead for years, substantiated through a death certificate filed with the city's Department of Health. In every instance of fraud that's documented in the indictment alleges that these defendants, Karina Andrian, Anna Trebich, Irina Zeltzer, carried out these schemes to enrich themselves at the expense of middle-class New Yorkers waiting patiently for the opportunity to access our limited pool of affordable housing. As the city's Inspector General, DOI also looked to see if there were failures in city processes that allowed this conduct to flourish essentially unchecked. We determined that HPD and Metro Management did not sufficiently maintain or monitor the wait list for Luna Park. Without a mechanism for tracking who rightfully belonged on the wait list, HPD was unable to detect phony applicants, leaving this process vulnerable to fraud and bribery. DOI will be issuing recommendations to HPD to close the corruption gaps exposed during this investigation, including recommendations that will strengthen HPD's oversight of the application process. Now that the indictment has been unsealed, those discussions with HPD can move forward. This indictment exposes some of the challenges, as the DA highlighted, in ensuring fair access to affordable housing in Brooklyn and around the city. But I'm encouraged that we can work proactively with DOI, implementing some of our previous recommendations that push for more effective oversight of management companies and boards at city-supervised Mitchell Lama apartments. And they've demonstrated a commitment to improving their processes going forward and coming up with new ideas. We at DOI will continue to be part of those conversations, as well as continuing to investigate and work with our partners to prosecute individuals who break the rules. At a time when the city continues to face a shrinking inventory of affordable housing, it is essential that we preserve access to our existing stock of affordable apartments for New Yorkers who meet the eligibility requirements and have patiently waited for their turn. It takes all of us doing our part to accomplish this. DOI, along with the Brooklyn District Attorney's Office, remains committed to doing our part. And in that vein, I want to remind everyone listening, if you suspect wrongdoing involving affordable housing, please report it to DOI at 212-3-NYC-DOI. New Yorkers are one of our best sources for information. In closing, I'd like to thank our great partners at the Brooklyn District Attorney's Office, its detective investigators, and the dedicated team of prosecutors who worked this case with DOI. Specifically, Senior Assistant District Attorney Vivian Young-Ju, Senior Assistant District Attorney Teresa Robitaille, under the supervision of the Chief of Organized Crime and Rackets, Chris Blank. I want to thank the Inspector General for the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development for their assistance, and the city's Department of Housing, Preservation, and Development for its cooperation on this investigation and in our efforts to resolve these issues going forward. Finally, I would especially like to thank our hardworking team of DOI investigators, specifically Assistant Inspector General Maria Horvat, under the supervision of Deputy Inspector General Mike Antolini, Senior Inspector General Jessica Hegan, Associate Commissioner Jay Flaherty, Deputy Commissioner Dom Zarella, and First Deputy Commissioner Dan Court. And I'd like to thank DOI's NYPD Detective Squad for its outstanding work on this case. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Commissioner. Any questions? Yes, in the back.
I mean, you talk about Mitchell Lama and you found this case of Luna Park, but frankly, co-ops in general are notorious for having these sort of questionable sort of subterfuge systems in place, illicit ways of obtaining apartments. Do you think this illustrates a need for stronger oversight of Mitchell Lamas and/or of co-ops in general, in the form of new legislation and new regulations?
Let our commissioner talk about oversight.
So I don't know about legislation, but I think we are actively working with HPD. I think there's no question that there is greater need, in particular for HPD to modernize their processes for oversight. There's approximately 45,000 city supervised Mitchell Lama apartments in New York City. Currently a staff of 2 people working with paper applications and a paper list, monitor access to those apartments. So it makes it very challenging. I think this case illustrates how complex it can be. Applications that appear legitimate on their face require a lot of work, and modernizing HPD's processes and putting more resources into maintaining the stock, I think would help a lot, and we're working with HPD on those issues.
Yes, good.
So what happens to the people who paid the bribes, though? You were talking about people who accepted them. Are they going to have any, what happened to them?
So the investigation, as I indicated, there were 18 apartments that are part of this conspiracy that was indicted today. The investigation will continue for potential other residents who paid bribes to get access to these apartments and be awarded these apartments. HPD will then see whether or not they're eligible to remain there. They may be subject to other eviction, and there's possible other proceedings that could take place on that. And to the former question, part of the problem is that a lot of these applications are from the 90s, and, they're paper, and they there's a backlog in getting this information updated. But yeah, go ahead.
So you're saying there are probably people living in the Luna Park complex right now who paid these bribes who are still living in those apartments?
Correct. Yes.
Can you give us a sense of how widespread you think this is at Mitchell Lama apartment complexes throughout the city, and also if it's more widespread in Luna Park itself?
Well, I think we believe that there are other tenants in Luna Park who've paid bribes. In terms of other Mitchell Lamas, that I think that the issue of oversight is an important issue that has to be reviewed. But this case, the investigation only focused on Luna Park, and I don't want to, make sort of a guess of what's happening in some of these other places.
If I could follow up, I guess the question is, are you expanding your probe to include other Mitchell Lama complexes, both in Brooklyn and the other 5 boroughs?
We don't comment on ongoing investigations and what we're doing with those. We're aware that the problems that existed in Luna Park likely exist in other places.
How long is the waiting list for these apartments?
So the waiting list at Luna Park has thousands of families, and some of those lists go back to the early 1990s. There are people who applied in the 1990s that still have not received apartments.
Decades.
And you said 2 people at HPD handle all of these apartments for the city. How is that even possible? Okay. That's how they do this.
That's a good question.
Yes.
Is there any look, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Any look at HPD to see if anybody there got bribed as well?
So we have no reason to think that anyone at HPD was involved in any wrongdoing. I think the problems at HPD, and we're working